Welcome to the P5 Masterclass videos. You're watching video number 5, P5 Archive. Ideally, watch these videos in sequence, starting with the installation and licensing video, followed by either number 2 or 3, depending on the type of target storage you wish to back up or archive to, followed by number 4 or 5, depending on whether it's a backup or an archive workflow you're wanting to set up. By watching 3 of these videos in sequence, you'll be able to install and set up a backup or archive workflow to your desired storage. You'll find more videos to explore in this series on Archiware's YouTube channel. Lots to cover in this video, starting with a whiteboard overview of the concepts involved in archiving. Then we do a straightforward archive and restore, and then we start digging into the configuration of archive plans and indexes. Chapters will be included in the description for the video where you'll be able to click directly to them. So in this video we're going to talk about P5 Archive, which is the module within the P5 suite, and we're going to be talking about how we get files from your storage onto either LTO tape or cloud using P5 Archive. And what we have to do is we have to create an archive plan within the P5 configuration. So here is one archive plan. We can have several of those. And the archive plan will take data from your P5 clients. So you get a client called localhost created when you install P5 on your P5 server. So localhost is the P5 client where P5 server is running, but you might also have P5 installed on a QNAP over here, and this is another P5 client from which you can archive and restore. So you can have as many of these different clients as you want to configure and as your license allows, and the data from these clients can then be archived through the archive plan, and the archive plan will take the data from the localhost machine, from the QNAP, and then it's going to write it out to a pool, a storage pool, and this is what is described in the 2 videos about LTO storage pools and cloud storage pools. So you may have a pool consisting of a bunch of tapes, so these are our LTO tapes that might be in one pool with a given name, or we might have another pool over here which is comprised of AWS cloud storage. So we've got different pools that we could write to from our archive plan, and then the data that we're writing from the clients to the storage pools is then tracked in an archive index. So over here we have our archive indexes, and we could have several of these. So we could have the default one, which is created when you install P5, or we could have another one which is specific to a particular client whose data we're archiving. And so what happens is that the overall flow is that if I have a file over here on my QNAP and I want to archive it to tape, then my archive plan will specify that the tape pool is going to be used for the data that it's archiving, and it might also be the default archive index that's going to be used to track the data. So the basic elements of the archive plan is to describe the pool that we're going to write to and the index that we're going to track the data in, and then the file that we're archiving over here is going to get written both into my archive index over here and also onto one of the tapes in the tape pool that we're archiving to. And then we have a browsable index that we can look in and find our file, and when we want to restore that file, the index points to that file up here on the tape, knows which tape the file is on and whereabouts on the tape that is, and then the restore process, which is independent of the archive plan, could then be used to select a file or files and then restore that all the way back to the original QNAP storage where the file came from. But when you're restoring, you have flexibility. So alternatively, I could restore it back to the localhost client and pick a folder on there to restore to. So the workflow for archive is that you need to have some P5 clients, and this was covered in the installation video, the setup and installation of P5 on those client hosts. So you could have P5 running on the QNAP or down here on a Windows server or a Linux server or wherever you want to run us. And then you create the archive plan up here, which describes which pool we're going to archive to and which index we're going to archive to. And then you use that archive plan to do archiving. You select files from storage and they will be archived to the chosen storage pool, and it will be tracked using the archive index that you specify in the archive plan. One additional thing to say is that it might be that there are pools specified in the archive plan. Since version 7.4, you can specify up to 3 target pools. So that means you could have 2 different sets of tapes written by the same run of an archive plan, or you could have a different storage. You could have LTO storage and cloud storage written by the same archive plan. So in the remainder of the video, we're going to focus on the archive plan, the configuration, the setup of an archive plan, how that then points to pools and indexes. We'll look at archive indexes so you know what one is, how to access the default one, how to create additional ones if that's necessary for your workflow. And then we'll look at how you actually do archiving and get a file from some storage onto a tape or into some cloud storage. And then how you restore it back again. Okay, so let's get into how archiving happens in ArchiWare's web interface. So here we are in our familiar browser-based administration interface for P5. We're going to be focused on the Archive tab for this video. And given that we already have separate videos showing how to configure clients and storage, I've gone ahead and set up an additional data source, which is my Windows server here. So in addition to localhost, which is the file systems and disks attached to the host where P5 is installed, I also have P5 running on this Windows server, and I can access that by plugging in an IP address and the login credentials to get to P5 running on that Windows machine. And we'll see how we're able to access storage on that server in a moment. Then under Storage Manager, I have a tape library added. The tape library's got a single drive in it that's a little bit old, but it's fine for our purposes. I also added a cloud service, so there's an Amazon S3 bucket added, and this results in us having storage pools, one for archive LTO, which is a tape-based pool, which, as you can see over on the right hand side, has 2 volumes inside it. So under our pools for this archive LTO pool, we can see that there are 2 tapes. And then the S3 Cloud Archive pool is a container volume, which means it's elastic. It will just use as much space as you want it to. So this only requires 1 volume. And then down in the volume list, we can see our 2 tapes, these 2 here, which are positioned in slots 1 and 2 of AWJB0, which is the jukebox or tape library. These tapes have got no data on them, and neither has the container volume, which is our AWS S3 cloud bucket that we're going to write to. So that's the pre-configuration stuff necessary to show you some archiving. So we've got some data sources, we've got some pools and some volumes within those pools, 2 tapes and 1 container volume. And then we can move on to the archive plan, which is where everything comes together and we can actually archive some data. So what I'm going to do first is just run through archiving some data to LTO tape in the quickest fashion possible, so that you can fairly quickly within this video get a feel for how things fit together. And then we'll backtrack a little bit and start going into the details and adding a more advanced configuration to our archive that will include looking at incremental archiving versus full, looking at the generation of previews, thumbnails and proxies for media files that we're archiving, and also how to store metadata, how to verify the data that you've written to tape or cloud and so on. And we'll also look at archiving to cloud and how you can have an archive plan which will archive to both LTO and cloud in one hit, or even 2 different LTO pools. So to begin with, we're going to go to the archive plan section under the archive tab at the top, and we'll create a new archive plan which I will call LTO Archiver. So this is going to be an archive plan that will archive to LTO tape, and then the most important section of configuration within your archive plan is under the General tab. It's the first thing you see when you create one, and that is to define the target storage. So here I'm going to pick my LTO pool because I said this is the LTO archiver, and then the target index. Now, archive indexes is something that we need to run through. These are the databases where all of the files and folders that you're archiving are represented, so that you can browse that database to see what you archived. And P5 always installs an archive index called default archive when you install the product, which is why that one is showing up in the menu as the target index. So we create this index and make it the default. So if you don't do anything else, you get an archive index that will store what you're archiving. But you may want to create more than one archive index. And in this video, we will cover under what circumstances you might want to do that, what are the advantages, when not to do it, etc. So I'll talk a little bit about that and do a bit of whiteboard about it. The third option in this section is called file filter, and you need to create file filters before they show up in this menu. This is otherwise a fresh install, so there aren't any file filters. But if you wanted to filter out all JPEG files, for example, then you could make a filter that said star.jpg exclude, and then no JPEG files would make it into your archive. Again, we can look at the creation of filters in a separate part of the video. Finally, down at the bottom, you can choose who's able to access this archive plan if you've got users set up and divided up into groups. But as I just said, we're going to keep it simple to start with. So my configuration just needs to be the target storage, which is my LTO pool, the target index, I hit apply, and that's all of the configuration necessary to do the most simple archiving with P5. So we can ignore all of the other tabs that we've got at the top here that we'll come back to. All we've done is indicated the storage that we want to write to and the index that we want to use to track what we're writing to the storage. So I can close that. I can see my archive plan showing up in the list. And if given that I didn't configure any hot folder automatic archiving within the archive plan, we'll need to use this archive plan via manual archiving, which shows up over here on the left hand side. So manual archiving lets you browse by default the top level of the file systems attached to the clients that you've got configured in P5. And under clients we get the local host, which is the server where P5 is actually running. So this is always included. This is the P5 server, and then any other clients that you add will show up. And so under manual archiving, under file system access, you'll be able to access file systems either on localhost, and I'm clicking and I see the top level of this, this Mac, which is our local host, or if I click on the Windows server, I'll see the top level of that computer, which will be the C drive and the D drive. Now the data that I want to archive, I know where it is. It's on the localhost machine, and it's down in this users folder on the desktop, and I've got a folder called demo files. So let's say this is the folder of interest that most of my archiving is gonna want to, I'm gonna need to browse to do archiving. But it's a bit of a bind to do this clicking every time to find the folder. So one thing I'm just going to show you up front is when you're browsing your file systems to archive manually, you'll see that there's a button down here to access a section which is also under advanced here called login areas. So login areas takes us to the section where we're exposing file systems and archive indexes for browsing. And so you can control what file systems you can see or which bits of them, and likewise for indexes by understanding how to use this login areas section. So I'm going to create a new login area specifically to take me to my demo content. So I'm going to make a shortcut called demo content, and this will be a shortcut to a file system on the localhost client. So it could be a backup index or an archive index, but HFS localhost is our code for a file system on the localhost client. There's also an option to do the same thing for the Windows server here. And then with that chosen, I can browse down to my folder in this interface, but this will be the last time I have to do this because I'll now have an alias. So you'll see my folder is called demo files. So I'm going to make the name match up here, although it doesn't need to. And then I will apply this and close, and I'll now have demo files showing up as one of my newly created login areas. And now when I go to manual archiving, I can jump straight into my demo files without having to browse all the way down the folder structure. And if I wanted to hide this localhost object which takes us to the top level, I could go into login areas and I could simply disable that one, which is here with a right click, and now the only localhost storage I see is this demo files folder. So that's great. Now in here I've got some content that I can use just to illustrate archiving. So what I'm going to do is go into photos and add a couple of these photos to my archive selection. So I'm just clicking on the button at the bottom, which brings up this archive selection where we can see the two folders that I'm choosing to archive. I could then browse into a different folder within my demo files, and I could add some files in here, and I can basically build a list of things that I want to archive that might be from different locations on the storage on this client. And then when I'm ready to go, I click on the archive button, and at this point I get to choose the archive plan that I want to use to do this archiving, because it's the archive plan that determines the pool that's going to be written and the index that's going to be used and the preview generation and lots of other different factors around the way that we archive. So my archive plan, there's only one, so that's the one we choose. Specifying a location in the index is a special option, and you'd need to understand how the index works. So I'm going to tell you right now not to click that box unless you really want to do something quite different. And then database fields to describe all archived files. There are metadata fields included in any archive index. There's always a description field as a kind of first field starting point. And if you want to manually put metadata into the description field for all of these assets that we're archiving, you could do that. And I'm going to put Masterclass A in here just so we can illustrate how that works. So I'm going to click the start button and remember that we're writing to some LTO tapes, which are actually LTFS format. So P5 lets us know that we'll need to make sure that there are enough labeled LTFS volumes to complete this archive job. I've got 2 labeled and there's not much data here, so that's not going to be a worry. And now the interface tells me that there's a job scheduled, and if I click on the monitor button, we can see that we've got a job running in the job monitor, and it will tell us what's happening. So it's transporting a tape from slot 1 in the tape library into the tape drive. Now this monitor window, you can always get to it via the job log button up here, choosing job monitor. That will get you to the job monitor window, and the job monitor window shows you your scheduled jobs at the top, running jobs in the middle where we can see our running job, and then the completed jobs at the bottom. And then if you double click one of these side pieces, you can collapse them so that you get a bit more space, and you can use the chevron here to expand to see more detail about what's going on. And you can see we're providing the name and the barcode of the tape and what we're actually doing at the moment, which is rewinding the tape. We can currently see our file list that we're archiving because it's not very large, so we show all the files in the job monitor, and then for a second there you could see the files being saved. Now the tape's being unmounted and the job will complete in a moment. So our job completed, we can see it down here at the bottom, and we can double click on it to see the detail of what it did. Down here you can see that there were 48 files that were saved, 1.2 gig, saved to AWST0, which is the ID of our LTO drive. Did a full save of these files and these folders, and yeah, that all looks good. So the result of that is that we now have some files on one of our tapes. So if we go back to the main window and look at volumes, you can now see that the first of these two tapes has 1.23 gigabytes on it, so it's no longer empty. Likewise, the LTO pool has 1.23 gigabytes in it, because the pool is the sum of the two tapes, because the tapes are in the pool. And we can also now go and look at what we archived and restore something. So we do that under the Restore tab at the top here. And then under Restore, there are two types of indexes you can browse, Backup and Archive. So we're interested in the backup indexes. And the default archive, the index that I mentioned, is shown here, along with any other indexes you've got configured. And then once you're in an index, you can browse the folder structure that is represented by the files that you archived. So you can browse the folders and the files. So if we look down the path, we can see the path that we archived the files from, and then we can see the photos that we archived in here, and then we can backtrack along this breadcrumb trail at the top and go into the CCTV folder and see that there are some movie files in there. If I make the column a little bit wider, you can see these are AVI files. And if we double click on one of these files, we'll get information about the file, which tape it's on. So you can see this file is in the index because it was archived on the 5th of August at 5 past 4 in the afternoon. The size of the file is 96 megabytes, and it's on tape with ID 10002, which has the name Archive LTO number 1, and that tape is currently located in the Tandberg library over on this column over here. There are no previews or metadata shown, but this is where you would also see that information had we generated it. The archive index is searchable, so you can see some of these files are called school. So if I was to go to the top of the index and search for name contains school, I will find the files that are including that in their file name. If I switch on the information view over on the right hand side and highlight one of these files, there's a missing box at the top for previews, which we'll come back to, but at the bottom you can see the description Masterclass A that we input when we ran the job has been assigned to each file in the archive. So if I was to search for this text, which I can do, then I would result in finding all of the files in the archive index. When you're making a search, up here you can choose the field that you want to search, including metadata fields, and you can add multiple terms together using the plus button up here. So you could search for file names with bus inside, but also where the archive date is today, for example, which will find the same files. But if we were looking for stuff that was archived yesterday, then nothing was archived yesterday. So you can build searches with multiple terms, and you can save a search via this button up here, and then your saved searches will show up in the drop down over here. So the search feature in P5 is quite sophisticated, and for good reason, because you may have many millions of files that you've archived over decades, and it's here that you'll come to try to locate files that you've archived that you would like to restore. So speaking of restore, once I know what I want to restore, so let's begin with a search. So I'm going to search again for files that contain school this time, which finds these 3 files. Now I'm going to turn off my information view on the right hand side. Each of these files is contained in a directory, and the directory is shown at the bottom here. So if I click on the directory, RQware will put me into the directory, and then I can see all the files that were archived from this CCTV folder. So if I want to recover all of these files, I can highlight all of them, and then I could add them to a restore selection, which is much like the window that we used to queue up the archive in the first place. And the restore selection is a little box where I can go and browse around the index and add whichever files and folders I want to restore. And then when I'm ready to restore, I hit the Restore To button down here, and there's a couple of things to take care of when restoring. First of all, where do we want to restore the files to? By default, we're going to show the directory where the files originally came from, but we might want to relocate to a different place. So if we do, we would click the relocate box. So sorry, just to correct myself, if the relocate box is not ticked, then each file will go back to its original location. If the box is ticked, then it's up to you to specify the path where you want to restore to. You can use the file picker button on the right hand side here to perhaps create a new restore folder on your storage and then target the restore to some known place so that you're not overwriting files. But if the restore would overwrite files, then there's a conflict resolution section here where you can choose whether we overwrite the file or we don't overwrite the file, or only if the restored file is newer, or we can rename the restored file to make the file name unique by adding _r to the end of the file name. When restoring back to a new folder, obviously the conflict will not be needed because there's no files in that folder at the moment. So the next step is that RQware will traverse through the index, find all the files, and remember this might take a while because there might be folder structures containing millions of files, and then it will total up the number of files, the total storage space required, and where we're going to restore them to. And then importantly, in this box we list each of the LTO tapes that will be needed and indicate whether or not they are online. In the case of my restore here, the one tape that's needed is obviously still in the tape library, so the information here is that it's online in the Tandberg storage loader library. So I'm going to click the start button because I know the tape is available. I don't need to go find the tape and put it in the library or the drive. And then the monitor button again will give me a view of that job running, where it will put the tape in the drive, read the tape, put the data back on the disk. So let's wait for that job to finish. So there we go, the job finished. It restored 850 megabytes, and I can browse into my demo files folder on this Mac and see in the restore folder, here's the files that we just restored. So we just round tripped some files onto tape and back and looked at how we can see what we archived and restore stuff. So with the basics out the way, we'll now dig in deeper and look at how we configure our archive plan in more detail to get more out of P5 archive. Let's take a look at our archive plan in a bit more detail. If we go back to the archive plan that we previously configured, name LTO archiver, and it's archiving to our LTO archive pool. It's possible to add up to 3 pools so that a single run of an archive task will result in your data arriving in more than one storage media. We'll come back to that after this section of the video. So we'll also come back and talk about file filters. The indexing tab, anybody becoming familiar with P5 archive shouldn't touch any of the options in this section. I would recommend. The path prefix is a somewhat legacy idea, and we'll talk in a moment about incremental archiving, which will be broken if you change any of these settings. So leave these as they are. Auto archive is all about having a hot folder somewhere where you place data and it automatically gets archived. So what this consists of is, on a given client, you can choose a list of directories and they will be archived according to the schedule that you set up below. So for example, on localhost, we could pick our demo files folder and then we have one directory in a list that could contain many. And then with this being our demo files directory that we want to have archived automatically, we then have to choose a schedule by clicking on a new button to create a new schedule here. This by default is off, so it could be every day or every 5 days or on specific days of the week or on specific days of the month. So typically you might want to have a workflow running on weekdays and you want to archive each evening at 2300 hours. Or you could archive at intervals between 900 hours in the morning every 2 hours until 10 at night. So you have two options. You can either archive once per day or multiple times at intervals up until a stop time. And you can also set the scheduler up not to start until some specific date. And then if you apply that, you'll get an entry in the scheduler table. You'll see similar tables in various places throughout P5. You'll get an entry in here to indicate this schedule, and then you can add additional ones if you want to. You need to turn the automatic starting on over here to enabled and then apply the job. And then actually if we do that, we should be able to see in the job monitor under the scheduled job section, we can see that this will now run tomorrow at 8 AM. There's a slight discrepancy with daylight saving times between this one and this one that I'm aware of, which is why there's an hour difference. So that is going to run tomorrow at 9 AM, give or take daylight saving. And then if I disable this and apply in a few moments, that scheduled job will be removed from the job monitor. So that's the auto archive tab. The use case for that is really where people don't want to have to interact directly with the P5 manual archiving. They want to just put stuff in a location on their shared storage, and then P5's scheduler takes care of archiving the contents. Now that's particularly useful where you're going to be archiving a work in progress, let's call it, folder at intervals throughout the day, thereby creating snapshots of changing data throughout time in your archive. And then you would be able to look at any one of those points in time snapshots to restore something back to the state it was in at that particular point in time. So quite useful for kind of monitoring and capturing the state of a folder with changing files in it over time. So moving into the Options tab, I'm going to pick out the ones which I think need to be considered as most important. First one being verification. So if you're writing data, I'd say particularly to tape, you might want to enable verification because it will force P5 to reread the blocks of data from the tape, recalculate checksums, and you can see the enabled tells us the hashing algorithm that it's using, recalculate those checksums from what was read from tape to the ones that were stored on the tape the first time the data was written, and if they match, then that means that the data didn't change between being written and being read. Bear in mind LTO drives do read the data immediately after it's been written, and if something can't be read, it's rewritten automatically by the protocol within the drive. So there are some levels of verification always happening with LTO. This is a second layer. Will cause your jobs to take twice as long because the tapes have to pass again through the drive, which is also going to introduce wear on the tape. So all of these things have to be considered. But I'd say overall it's probably a good idea to verify archive data that's being written to tape, particularly with archive data, because you're going to be expecting to keep that for years, even decades. So you want to be sure that the data was readable on day one. Next one I would consider changing on here is the deletion. So if you want to run an archive with P5 and then assuming everything completes successfully, including verification, you want to delete the data, then you can do that via this menu. You can either delete the files and the folders, so the whole structure, or you can leave the folders in place and only delete the files, or you can remove the files but replace them with tiny stub files, which are basically interpreted by the desktop application that you can download for P5 for free, and you can use that desktop application to restore files from the stub files. So that's a workflow that deserves being covered properly in a separate video. I won't cover it in detail or even at all in this video. So I'm going to leave this on Do Not Delete, which is of course the default and the safe one, because you could potentially accidentally delete things, so be careful with this setting. And then the most important setting in the Options tab is the level of archive. So this is basically whether or not P5 will attempt to discover whether or not a file has already been archived and therefore doesn't need to be archived again. Just to summarize, the full setting, which is the default, will always save all of the files that you give us to archive. So if you give me a folder, give P5 a folder with 100 files, it will archive 100 files, and then if you archive it again, it will archive 100 files. Incremental will compare the file system that we're archiving from with the index, with the archive index, and the archive index has the path and the modification date and the size of the file to compare. So by making this comparison file system against index, we can see what's changed and what's new, and then we can just save the changed files and the new files. New files will include files that you move, because a file that you move effectively disappears at one location and appears at another, so we'll see that as a new file if you're doing incremental archiving. Therefore, if you change the name of a folder with a lot of files inside, then a lot of files are going to be re-archived even when you're archiving incrementally. So in order to overcome this re-archiving of files that have moved, we've introduced something called Incremental Plus in more recent, as of 2025, versions of P5. And what Incremental Plus does is it attempts to track files that are moving, that we've seen and archived before, by inserting a ID into an extended attribute on the file system. So this means that the file system has to support extended attributes, and if it does, P5 will insert its own little key into the file that it can then later look at and look at the index to see if we've already archived that file, even if it's moved. So we introduced this fairly recently, and it requires the file system supports extended attributes, and if the file system does, then you should be able to move files around without them being re-archived, and P5 will update the index to show where the files now are after they've moved, without actually saving any additional data back to the tape or cloud device. So that's a great feature to use and to try out. And because there's some complexity in what you're choosing in this menu, there's a more text available in the user interface, which should pretty much summarize what I've just said. Pause the video and reread that to get a bit more information. Okay, so that takes me to previews and metadata, these two tabs up at the top here. One of the features of P5 Archive is that it has a mini media asset management style interface for allowing thumbnails of images and thumbnails and proxies, playable low-res, potentially short versions of media files that you can play back within P5's archive index, so that when you are exploring files that you archived 10 years ago, you can see what those files were, play some of them back, look at thumbnails of images, etc. So the kind of functions that you would normally expect from a media asset management type software. So in order to do this, we are using third-party plugins, open source software called FFmpeg and ImageMagick. This is just showing that these are available and the versions that we're using within P5. These will be not bang up to date, but it's possible to install your own versions of these so that P5 will use fresh, up-to-date versions of these tools that will be better adapted for the hardware that you're running on, versus these kind of generic versions which we use, which are running across a lot of different platforms. So in order to start generating previews, we divide them up into two categories. So if I add a new preview generator here, the two categories are basically FFmpeg for rendering from video files or even audio files as well, and ImageMagick for rendering from these types of file extensions, so PNGs, JPEGs and so on. So still images versus moving images or audio files basically. So these are two default or basic configurations you can see in the menu, or you can have your own. So we're going in this training video, we're going to look at these two basic configurations. First one is FFmpeg, and if I apply that, it'll show up in the list. And then the other one is for ImageMagick, and I'll apply that one, and that will show up in the list. And then I can go back and double click to edit these, and you'll see that there are some options for generating proxies or previews of moving files. And that is, you can choose a scale and a bit rate for the video and the audio, or you can go in and tailor the exact way that the FFmpeg software is being used to give us back this proxy of the video file that you're archiving. So you could come in here and you could tweak it. For example, if I add -T20, then that will limit the amount of time in the proxy to the first 20 seconds. And there's all kinds of things that you can change in there. So let's just make that change so that we get short proxies. And then under ImageMagick, you can choose the size of the thumbnail. So I normally like to go for one that's 256, so it's a little bit more crisp in the browser interface. So let's apply that. And then if we go and archive some video and images, we'll see the results of our preview generator. So let's go and archive some images and video files and then see what that does in the archive index. So we'll apply the changes to our archive plan, and then we'll go to the manual archiving section here, and we'll find some files that we want to archive. So I've got a folder here with a lot of small JPEGs in. So let's just take some of those and add those to an archive selection. And then I'm going to go back to this CCTV. There's some publicly available video files, so let's just take 2 of those because we don't want this to take too long. So we'll add 2 video files into our basket, and then we'll hit archive, and using the LTO archiver. Now I forget which pool I left this writing to, so I'm actually going to go back to my archive plan and just check. So yeah, this is actually writing to the cloud storage, so that's fine. So I'm going to start the job. I really should have given that a more generic name when I created my archive plan, because it's not just archiving to LTO. Indeed, it could be archiving to both cloud and LTO. So you can see here we've got an archive plan. It's going to write 15 files to the cloud. Now the cloud writing part shouldn't take too long. There's a couple of 100 megabytes worth of videos, I think, and then the JPEG files are tiny. But after we've written the files to the storage and indexing those files into the default archive index, we will then run FFmpeg and ImageMagick to generate those proxies. So you can see that's going on now. It says generating previews 10 of 15, and then the job finishes. And if we look at the default, if you look at the detail for the job, we can see that 15 of 15 previews were loaded of 15 files that were saved. So that means every file got a preview. No metadata was loaded because we didn't yet configure the metadata part of the solution. So the result of that will be that if we now go back and view the archive index and specifically look for the files that we archived, which are in this folder initially, we see that there's a little graphical icon against these JPEGs now indicating that there are thumbnails for them. And if I click on the gallery button at the top, there's a pane of the UI opens up to display our thumbnails on the right hand side. So we see all the thumbnails in the current folder, and then we can also choose the scale at which those are displayed with the little slider at the bottom there. So if you can imagine, this is a folder that we archived a long time ago. We get a nice graphical representation of those files that we archived. So what about those video files? Those are in the CCTV folder, and we've already archived this folder. So we'll also see files that didn't have previews generated because we didn't re-archive the whole folder. But these two did. So we see thumbnails for those two files. And then additionally, if we switch on the information part of our UI here, for the currently selected file, we will see a proxy that is 20 seconds long that I can scrub around. And this is the first 20 seconds of this video file, downsampled to a 320 resolution, so it doesn't take up too much space on disk, and is available to play back within this mechanism. So that's how you get thumbnails and proxies visible in your archive index. And if we go back to our archive plan, under the previews tab there, you can add something called a custom script, which basically means that you specify a list of file extensions. Maybe you've got a camera raw file format that isn't supported by FFmpeg, so you could specify that file extension here, like .raw, for example. And then here you're specifying your preview converter script, which is going to be either a batch file on Windows or a shell script on Linux type operating systems, where the script will take the file that's being archived one at a time, do some processing using some tool, and then return back either a thumbnail or a small video file that will be used by P5's archive index. So there's information online about how to structure these scripts to get something back, and then you would apply that, and that will go into your list of preview generators. So I'll delete that one. Okay, under metadata, there's kind of two parts to the metadata within the archive index and the archive plan. The first part is that you can add metadata fields to an archive index. So these are locations in the archive index for each thing that you archive where you can store some information. For example, you could add a shutter speed metadata field, or you could add a codec metadata field, and then those fields could be populated by a script that interrogates the file that's being archived, pulls out the video codec, and then squirts it into P5. So the part where we're adding the fields we'll cover when we look in the next section in detail at archive indexes. And when you add an additional field to an archive index, you can either manually enter data into that field whilst you're browsing the archive index. You can kind of hardwire data to go into that field at the point that you're running an archive job manually. There's an option to fill out the metadata fields as we saw earlier. Or you can write a script, again a shell script or a batch script, that will use a tool to interrogate the file and output the metadata and put it in the field. So there's a fair amount of configuration needed to do this in P5. You need to be able to write scripts, you need to know what tool you're going to use to extract the metadata, and this has been covered in a separate video on our YouTube channel. So I'm not going to go into how to set up the metadata ingestion at this point, but you can look elsewhere to find that, and I'll link it in the description of this video. So before we move into looking in more detail at archive indexes, I just want to illustrate how you might want to do archiving to more than one pool. So if we add the LTO pool here as a secondary pool, so this archive plan will now archive to both cloud and LTO storage and apply, then let's run a small archive job to archive just a few of these JPEG files. And actually let's just pick the ones at the top, and we're going to hit archive, and I'm going to put in something unique, so I'm going to say tape and cloud to try and remember that, and we'll start the job. So these files will be written to tape and cloud, and I've written tape and cloud into the metadata field so I can search for them in the index and easily locate these files, because I want to show you how we can see that each of these files is being saved to both types of storage. So this job will take a little while to run because it actually, there's the first job at the top, which has ID 10,014, which actually spawns two jobs, 15 and 16, one of which is already completed because that was the cloud one. So the cloud job already completed because there's hardly any data that's being saved here, as opposed to 16, which is the job writing to the archive LTO pool, which needs to put a tape in the drive. And of course this is a moving of physical things around in a box, so this takes some time to do. But once that tape's in there, it will be written with those JPEG files and the job will complete. So let's wind forward to when the job has finished. Okay, so the job completed, and now if we go back to our index, we could search for the description field containing tape and cloud, and that should show us the files that we archived. And if I double click on one of these, we'll be able to see that this file was archived on the, if I just expand this column, this file was archived at 15:05, which is a couple of minutes ago, both to the container S3 storage at the top there and also to our tape. Ignore the other one, that was me testing earlier. So yeah, this file, picture of these leaves, is stored both on this archive LTO volume and in the cloud. So two copies for one run of the archive. The ability to archive to more than one pool is really useful in the case of LTFS, because this means that you can have the source data that you wish to archive, and then you can create two LTFS pools, FS pools. So you could have LTF1 and LTFS2. These are our two pools. And then we simply configure our archive plan to write to both pools. They don't even have to be the same LTO generation. So this could be LTO 9 and this could be LTO 8. And we'll simply need more tapes in the LTO 8 pool than the LTO 9 pool. All you need to do is label tapes in both pools and then simply run the job. If you have two drives, then P5 will use both drives to write the pool simultaneously. If you only have one drive in your library or on your desktop drive collection, then we will run in sequence. So we'll request tapes first in the LTFS1 pool and then in the LTFS pool 2 pool until everything's done. And then you can always add a cloud pool on top, like AWS or one of the cloud vendors, to have like an insurance copy of your data offsite in a cloud service, one of the low-cost ones, like Glacier Deep Archive that we support. So your data, if you have a fast enough WAN connection to support it, you get another copy of your data offsite somewhere entirely independent of where the first two sets of tapes are being stored. Okay, archive indexes. We've been using one called Default Archive, and if we go down here to Advanced Options and click into Manage Indexes, we can see our default archive index listed here. And if I double click on it, you can see some settings relating to this index. First of all, there is a location. So this is where in this folder below the P5 installation directory, you will find the database files relating to this archive index. In addition to some database files at this location, you'll also find a clips folder, and in that folder you'll find a directory structure, and under the directories you'll find both MPEG and JPEG files that are the previews and proxies generated for display in the Minimam interface. So all of that stuff lives in this directory listed here, and you may need to make sure that there's enough space or make a symlink or a junction point to provide enough storage to house the index, especially if you're storing a lot of MPEG files, maybe long MPEG files to go with the index to provide those previews. The archive index database files are absolutely crucial because they are the way that you restore data from tape. So if you've got lots of tapes with archive data but no archive index, then you would have to ingest the data indexes from those tapes, which can be very time consuming. Therefore, it's important to make backups of the archive index, and you do that via this section here, database backup. So we enable the backup here, and then we need to choose where we want the backup to run. Now, because I have this Windows server listed as a client where I can read and write data, it makes a lot of sense to use a separate host to the P5 server so that the data is sitting on a different machine. I can then go and browse on that Windows server, and we'll see those two drive letters C and D, and maybe I want to put these backups on D and make a new folder called Default Archive Index Backup. So we now know where and in what directory the backups are going to run. I want to keep 10 previous copies of my database, and I want this to run every day at 10:30. That's fine. At the same time that the backup is being made, it's possible to add a rebuild, which will reorganize and compact that database, the live archive database, but this can take some time. So I would only recommend doing this if you're running late in the evening and there's a few hours available for this to run and complete. So let's apply my schedule for daily and then apply the whole thing. And now I've protected my archive index by having this backup which will run each day. The backup will include both the database files and the clips directory. So we can apply and close those changes. It's possible to have more than one archive index, and we do that by clicking the new archive index button, which will give us a completely fresh archive index database. So I'm going to make one for my customer, let's call them customer A. So providing the name and hitting apply creates the database, and you can see it gets its path down here, archive customer A. And again, I could configure backups. But for this one, I just want to show you the rudiments of how you start using a new archive index, and also why and when you might want to create one. So having created this one, I'll close it, and then you can see my customer A archive index shows up in the list. But if I go to my Restore tab where I might expect to see it, it's not visible initially because I need to create a login area, which I mentioned earlier, to expose it. So although the index is created, OcuWare needs to know how to expose it to users and which parts of the index. And we do that through the login areas section. And there's a shortcut to that via that button. And then if I create a new login area, it would be to point to my customer A archive database. Then I can choose the text that will show up next to this index in the UI. So let's call it customer A with a space. Were there any folders inside the index, I could choose to only show the contents of a subdirectory within the index. And if I apply this, then that's enough configuration for now. If I go to restore, I'll now see my customer A index, albeit there are no files in there because we didn't archive anything to it. The beauty of exposing an index like this through a login area is that I could choose a subdirectory within the index and only show that to users logging into the P5 interface within a certain user group. So I could have different users archiving to different indexes and only seeing the indexes that are relevant to them in a more complex multi-user deployment of P5. In most cases, though, it's sufficient simply to create a login area like the one you can see here that points to the root of the index, and then you'll be able to browse that index. When we are configuring our archive plan now, we could choose the customer A as the target index for our archive data to be written into. So a given archive plan writes to a certain configuration of target storage and indexes that via a single archive index. So when might you want to create an additional archive index? Maybe I want to create an archive plan for a specific customer. So I create a customer A archive plan, and that archive plan writes to an index that's just for customer A, and it also writes to a storage pool that's also just for customer A. And that way I know if I browse in this index, I'll get customer A data, and that data will come from tapes in the customer A pool if I want to restore anything. So I have an independent workflow with an index and a set of tapes for storage, which is independent from my separate workflow for customer B, and so on. Now this is an alternative to having one big monolithic archive index for everything and one big set of tapes or cloud storage for everybody, and you have to decide whether or not it's necessary for you to know which tapes a particular customer's data resides on, or whether you're happy to mix everything together. If you want to have that subdivision, then it might make sense to make separate archive indexes and storage pools. Bear in mind though that when you come to want to restore something, you need to go into an archive index before you can get to the search button to start searching for something. So if I don't know which of these two archive indexes my files might reside in, I'll have to first click into this one and do my search, and if I don't find what I'm looking for, into the second one and do my search. If you have a lot of archive indexes, this can become quite cumbersome unless it's going to be very clear to everybody where a particular piece of archive data resides in terms of which archive index you used to archive it. So earlier in the video you will have noticed that there is a description field available for each of the assets that we've archived. So this is stored in the archive index, a field called description. And when we are doing manual archiving from the web interface like so, then we get the option to put something in this metadata field which will then be visible and searchable afterwards. So this interface here, when archiving, allows you to fill one or more of the metadata fields in at the point that you're archiving manually. Obviously, just having a description field is fairly limiting, and the whole idea of the P5 archive index is that it can be expanded in terms of the amount of metadata that you want to store, and also provides an interface for automating the input of that metadata by running tools that interrogate files. So if we go to the customer A index that we just added, you can right click on this index and go to fields, or indeed you can use the burger menu down at the bottom to go to fields, and this brings up a new window which will allow you to see existing fields and edit fields and add fields. So as a quick example of how this works, if we wanted to add a new field called photo caption, we could do that, and we have to fill in all of these fields going across horizontally to add the field to the database. So the fields can be either text or number as their type. They can be case insensitive if you want to have easier searching, where we don't care about upper and lower characters. That's case insensitivity, so that means that you can search without worrying about matching the correct case. Application name is simply a name that contains spaces for display within the UI. So for this field I might want to call it photo caption. The comment is optional. The input field type can either be a drop-down menu or a text field. So I'm adding this photo caption field because I want to import captions embedded in some stock photos into P5's archive index so that I can then search within those captions to find images. So this is going to be a text field. If it's to be a drop-down, then you can add values to the drop-down list here. 1, 2, so you've got 2 items in a drop-down menu, but for our purposes we don't want that. We want this to be a text field. Single row is enough in the UI, and we want this to be the second field below description. So then I hit the plus button to add the field. You'll notice that P5 always prepends user underscore in front of the name that you provide. So bear that in mind when you're referencing this field name in a script, which we'll very briefly look at in a moment. So I've added a second field. I could delete fields or add more fields. Once I'm done, I'll close this window. And with the additional field added to this customer A archive index, when I'm manually archiving, like so, I'll see that field available to me as a field that I could manually fill in. But it's more interesting with this field to have it filled in automatically at the point of archive. And we do that by going back to our archive plan and then looking in the metadata tab, where we can add a new user-defined metadata import script using this window. And the files that I want to generate this caption for will be JPEG files. So I want this script to run for JPEG files with both spellings of the JPEG extension. And then I need a metadata import script, which looks like this. So this text editor window is showing us a very simple script that actually has 2 lines in it that aren't comments. Apologies if you're not familiar with writing batch files or shell scripts, but I'll be quick here. So what's happening here is that we are setting up an attribute and then echoing the name of our field that we just added, followed by that attribute that we put a value into. And everything here is a command that's running to find what that attribute should be. We're running something called EXIF tool, which is able to extract EXIF data from images. And we're extracting something called the caption. Caption abstract is the name of the field. Then the stuff at the end of the line here is just filtering the results that are generated by EXIF tool so that just the caption is passed into that user photo caption field. The path to my script needs to go in here, which looks like this, and this can time out after 1 second. I'll explain this value later. So we apply the script and then that will show up here. The script needs to be set to be executable on a Mac, so bear that in mind. And then we can apply the archive plan and go archive some files. So in my demo files folder, this Ansel Nance images folder has a bunch of JPEGs in it that do have these captions inside. So I'm going to just archive these 3 folders using my LTO archiver, but not entering anything in here. If I were to type a caption in at this point, then that would override what the script provides, I believe. But I could put a description in like there should be a caption, and then the caption field will be automatically filled out by the script. So then we can start that job. This one is now set to archive to my cloud storage, so this will finish quite quickly. And the output from the job will indicate down here that as well as generating thumbnails, we've also generated metadata via our script for 26 out of these 29 files. And then the way to view that metadata is simply to go and browse our customer A archive index and then drill down to those files that we just archived in this folder. And then under biking, for each one of these, we'll see that there is a photo caption which has miraculously appeared in the field because it was embedded inside of the original JPEG. So road biker and so on. And same goes for the clouds folder, etc. And of course these photo caption and description fields can be edited in here and applied if you want to make changes, and can also be searched. So I can see Cumulus showing up in this caption. So if I do a search for my photo caption contains CUM, then we'll find 3 photos of clouds. So this is how briefly you can create a script, attach it to an archive plan, and then start to have the benefit of being able to see and search metadata for the assets, the media assets that you're archiving. Let's next look at our archive indexes in a little bit more detail, picking the default archive index here. We've already talked about how the archive index can be browsed, and you can explore the directory path structure right down to the files, and you can see the path at the top, which allows you to backtrack to points above you in the path. The search button allows us to search for file names or even items of metadata or dates to locate items in the archive index. But one additional important feature of the archive index is this menu over here, which allows us to browse the snapshots, e.g. points in time, when this index was modified by archive jobs running. And if I position myself back on the 5th of August rather than the 6th of August date here, then you can see that there are only about 8 files archived on the 5th of August at that time, but the most recent snapshot that was created on this date allows us to see that there were many more files in the index. So this menu initially just allows you to go back a few days. If you click the More Options link, you get a more sophisticated way to look at these snapshots, in that you'll see more, and if there are many hundreds, as there would be in an installation which has been in use for a while, then you'll also get to choose a start and end date ranges in which you wish to search for snapshots. So this allows a folder which is changing and may have entirely different files on it at different dates, which is what would happen if you were archiving a hot folder using the automatic archive technique every day. Each day you might see completely different files in a hot folder. Then this allows you to go browse through the index and see what was in that folder on given dates. Of course, if you search for a file name, then we'll search through all of the snapshots in the index and provide search results pointing to files within specific snapshots. On the right hand side of the index options window, you can also see that we can cause the index to only show us data based on a specific pool, or even tapes within that pool in the case of this archive LTO pool. So this is really powerful. You can see the default will merge all of the pools that we've written to. So if we look at one asset in this folder, we can see that this file was archived both to the LTO pool and the cloud pool, of course, because we archived using an archive plan which had got the multi-pool archive configured to archive to 2 pools in one go. So that's how this file got into our archive index. But if we only wanted to see the copies of files that were on our LTO pool or on our cloud pool, we can use these checkboxes to limit what we're seeing on the left-hand side, and therefore make it easier to select data that's stored on specific pools for restore. Okay, that wraps up this P5 Archive Masterclass video. There are additional pieces of information which are not covered in order to keep this video down to a reasonable length. There may well be an advanced video on this topic to mop up on some of the features that may have been mentioned in this video but not covered in detail. Thanks for watching.